This lecture concerns religion, specifically the differences between polytheism and monotheism. Polytheism referring to the worship of many gods or belief in many gods, poly, and monotheism, the belief in one God, mono. Now, religion was central to the making of civilization. It was central in providing stories that help humans make sense of the world they lived in, from their daily life to the very political organizations which structured to their societies. So we have to think of religion as a set of beliefs that are about making meaning about your place in the world and the world around you. And what characterized the ancient world was polytheism, as opposed to the monotheism which the Hebrews embraced. So what are the characteristics, features of polytheism? First, there is no clean separation between the natural and the supernatural. For most people, the gods were everywhere and involved in everything. What happened on earth was magically connected to what happened in the heavens, the afterlife for the Egyptians, or the skies for the Greeks. Second, the myths that anchored religions help tell the stories of these gods and how they came to relate to humans and what the nature of that relationship was. And of course, what values should be embraced, celebrated, and revered. 3, tensions in the world were often explained by competition between deities. So the gods were not necessarily representatives of good and evil, but represented natural opposing forces. The question was then, in this cosmic struggle, how were humans to know what was right and what was just? This is how priests and priestesses came in, but also how people articulated the values they believed in. This way of giving meaning to the world meant humans had to A, try to comply with the will of gods or risk being punished, or B, secure the favor of the gods through a representative, through gifts and services. And it was believed that the response of the gods would be proportional to the effort. This system of prayer, honor, and service, designed to secure the goodwill of the gods, helped to motivate people not only to build temples, but to maintain these temples or build walls. And religion also became the justification for obedience to a priest king or a divinely justified king. In this way, we can see how religion served to unify society. It served as a legitimizing force. It helped make sense of arbitrary rule or seemingly inexplicable events. For people, it meant that they could see how their existence as a community had meaning and how their collective behavior, expressed in ritual, myth, and worship, gave them some control over natural force. Now, the Hebrews are a different story. And this minority people you can read about in your textbook. They were committed to the worship of one God, in fact, invented monotheism, inscribed in what we refer to as the Old Testament. And the Old Testament can be understood as an oral history of the Jews. It was written in Hebrew between 1250 and 150 BCE. Keep in mind, this was written over time. Now, what separates the religious beliefs of the Hebrews from those of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, or the Greeks were their monotheism. They regarded their one God as fully sovereign. It ruled all and was subject to no laws. Unlike the Near Eastern gods, Jehovah was not created. God was eternal and the source of all creation in the universe. He, as he is referred to in these texts, he created and governed the world and shaped the moral laws that govern humanity. That means God was transcendent, that is, above nature and not part of nature. Nature was therefore demystified. It was no longer supernatural, but purely natural. Nature was, in fact, the example of God's handiworks. It's important to keep in mind that this monotheism, in fact, made possible the awareness of the self, of the individual. And in fact, This was because the individual was understood to be self-conscious and aware of his or her moral autonomy and worth. In that sense, the Hebrews believed man was a free agent and man had the capacity to choose between good and evil. Although God was omnipotent, he was also just and merciful. And notice how this is understood to be exclusively masculine. But what existed was a moral contract between God and his people, the Hebrews, and that is different than polytheism. And we need to keep this in mind because it is out of Judaism that Christianity will emerge. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we understand the Old Testament and the Bible in general as historians, not as faithful. Because the Bible is not so much a book, but a library of books written by different authors at different times and in different styles. The Hebrew Bible is referred to as the Old Testament and made of 24 books. And the oldest copies that existed until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was the Greek translation in Alexandria from 287 to 247 BCE. But then people made an amazing discovery in the caves of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And these discoveries lasted from 1947 to 1957. You can see the map and the photographs in the PowerPoint. A group of Bedouins found scrolls in cave jars that were in fact buried in caves. And that is important because a cave would be dark, would stave off the humidity, but also not be subject to wide variations in temperature. Those are the principles that help the preservation of documents. So these Bedouins knew Europeans were interested since there were so many archaeological digs, and they brought these to Europeans. Over the course of the next 10 years, after 1947, in various caves, 100 manuscripts were discovered. 4 for biblical texts, 200 biblical texts in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And in fact, the texts of the Torah represent 43% of these. And this was an amazing resource for historians and theologians because it put in question assumptions regarding the writing and Genesis over the Bible. So the enduring question is, why were these manuscripts there? Some thought these caves were a geniza like that of Cairo. A geniza is an archive built next to a synagogue because in Judaism, one cannot destroy a piece of paper that mentions the name God. Others thought this was the work of a Jewish sect, the Essenes. None of these explanations have endured. But there has been an amazing find because in the remaining manuscripts, historians have discovered that many are legal texts explaining how to regulate Jewish religious life, the purity of law, cultural feasts, but also narratives with same themes but different stories. For instance, the story of Adam and Eve who wait 7 years for the serpent to arrive in Eden. It tells us about people's lives and shows us that the stories we have inherited were modified and revised over the years and may not have been the same for everyone. So in fact, monotheism was a set of beliefs that was in the making, written, rewritten over hundreds of years.